Hello everyone, this is Bradley. So today this is a preset tutorial talking about this proximity Falloff node, which you can download for free from the link in the description. Firstly, I have to clarify, it's not my intention to make a tutorial for all of my presets. Especially in this case, proximity Falloff node is a very commonly used preset. I probably use that for almost 80% of the tutorial because I work with mograph a lot. Today, this is a huge exception, and I will discuss the reason later. Before we move on, let's get some brief overview of this proximity Falloff node. Here, within this node tree, consider as a grid, and I try to use the setup position to offset its vertices location using this combine XYZ. If I do not have proximity Falloff, then you can see how I change the z-axis to affect the entire geometry. With the proximity Falloff, there is only a spherical area being affected due to this proximity Falloff. Let's start with a default proximity Falloff node so that we can know how to actually manipulate everything. If I plug this Falloff directly into the Z, then you can see we do not have elevation as we have been shown with this node. Okay. Most of the time we are trying to use an object to control the proximity Falloff. So let's generate an spherical empty. Okay. And within this node tree, we need to select these empties. And you can move that within the viewports. This is very handy and you can scale that up and down. So this is the benefit of using an object to control this proximity Falloff, because there are so many shortcuts you can use instead of using any kind of dry values like 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. Okay? But in other cases, what if you do not want to use an object? For example, you may want to use the vector from this kind of sample curve node. There is only a position without any objects or geometry. In such a kind of case, you can use this location offset, in which you can try to use the combine XYZ. Okay, and it's just the plus minus. Then you can see, even if I'm not using the empties, the Falloff region is being moved. This is equally true to the scale offset. You can increase or decrease without changing the size of your empty. Here, by default, the Falloff always outputs a value from 0 to 1, which means if you try to change this elevation scale, then you can actually manipulate this maximum or minimum output. Okay. So basically, these are the standard procedure of using this proximity Falloff node. This is pretty basic, something I've shown in many of my tutorials. And the basic building of this node is related to the geometry proximity node, in which we're using the distance. Here, if I directly using these points modes and plug the distance, you can see there is no effect because we also need a target. Okay. The target of evaluation, we need an object, but if we use an object of an empty and it seems like we plug the geometry in the target, you will realize there is no any effect because empty does not have a geometry. So the way that you need to do is to actually use a mesh line, and you need to plug the location into the starter location and you use contact 1. But there is also a problem that you realize that because it's using the distance is always increasing when it's get farther away. So what you need to do is actually use a map range. Okay, you use map range to reverse all the relationship so that the minimum becomes 1, maximum becomes 0. And this is how you actually manipulate that. Okay. But this also comes to a problem that if you use an empty to scale up and down, it does not change everything. Okay. So to resolve this kind of issue, you need to use the scale into the maximum. Then you have this effect. So essentially, this is kind of 4 nodes. Okay. It can be shorter because this similar concept can be also used with a vector math, in which you turn everything into a distance. Okay, so you distance the location and distance with the position, which is equally true to the source position, and you output that. So in whichever case, it seems like you need to use 4 nodes for this kind of basic function. If you would like to add more stuff, for example, as I mentioned with this location offset, as I mentioned with this scale offset, then you have to keep adding mass node or vector mass nodes and so on and so forth. Okay. Here, I want to mention that these are the basics of basics, and it's not only addressed by me, but also addressed by many other tutorialists over and over again in different kind of animations. They earn billions of more views than I do, so I expect you know these kind of basic concepts. And instead of explaining this over and over again in every of my tutorial, I provided these free presets. Okay. On the other hand, although I've always said that you do not need to know how a preset is being built in order to use that, I want you to always bear in mind of this kind of basic setup while I'm not explaining these kind of basic things. Because I more refer to kind of details. For example, maybe sometimes I do not want to use an empty. I want to use an actual geometry. So I need to actually add a switch to determine, oh, sometimes I would like to use an empty, sometimes I would like to use an actual geometry, for example, a UV sphere, ICO sphere, a Suzanne monkey for evaluation. Okay, so I add a lot more features into these group nodes, which is not required functionality in most cases. It's like a blender. You put a lot of dreams into this open source software. For example, there's sculpting, like ZBrush, texture painting, like whatever software, and rendering, compositing, scripting, and so on and so forth. But it does not necessarily mean that you always need to use these features in order to complete your work. So there may be a lot of functionality. For example, if you go to this proximity fold, you can see there's a lot more nodes than the 4 nodes I just mentioned. And there are even 3 group nodes for various things, okay? But they aren't always necessary. The main concept of this entire proximity fold is actually just the 4 nodes, okay? Whether you're using the geometry proximity or distance, it's basically just the 4 nodes. Okay, so you need to bear in mind of how they are being built or being used so that you can replicate without a group node. Okay. So here, let's go back to the discussion of this proximity fold. As I've explained earlier, that this is pretty straightforward to use, that you just add an object and you scale it up and down, you get the result. And of course, this fold does not only work with the setup position, but also the instance size or many other things. Here, by instancing cubes on the grid with proximity fold into the scale, then you can see the center cubes are always very large, and the peripheral cubes are as small as 0. And you can definitely change all this kind of value to scale it up and down and so on and so forth. Okay. However, there's one issue that you need to realize if you try to set a position and the instancing points. You can see the center cubes are never as large as they were. This is not a bug within my presets. This is due to the foundation of how geometry nodes actually work. This means that even without using the preset, you still get the same issue, okay, in which the center points are not as big as they were when you do not have this set position. Okay, so how to resolve this kind of issue, or what's the reason? As I've explained in my field tutorial, that all this kind of position, whether it's a node or a socket, they do not have value by their own. Their value are actually retrieved from this kind of green geometry data block. Okay, which means if you change this kind of position value using this set position during the node tree, then they are outputting a different position value, they are being evaluated differently, and thus they are outputting different values even with the same node tree. Okay, so the way to resolve that is you have to capture attribute. So let's capture a position attribute. A position attribute is a vector, so you need to take a position. Okay, and we use this captured position to replace the value, and you solve all this kind of problem. Okay, so here let's remove all this kind of whatever stuff, and we can do the same with this custom vector socket. Okay, and use this fold now, and we resolve the problem. So here I just want to mention all this kind of custom vector or whatever other stuff are not made by my own. it's actually everything lays in the foundation of how geometry nodes works. So do not blame on my presets because you will have the same issue with this source position. Okay. This means even with the usage of presets, you still need to learn the basics of geometry nodes. In fact, the presets are only made to speed up your workflow. So for example, to save like 4, 5, 6 nodes, but it does not stop you from learning geometry nodes. Okay. At the end, I would like to discuss something very important, and it turns out to be the reason I start this tutorial. Okay. So right now, I'm trying to scaling this object up and down to do a transition, and you realize the center cube is always very large. Okay, my empty is at 0, 0, 0, and you can realize the center point of our grid must also be 0, 0 as well. And this actually explains why this transition is so sharp. Actually, there is no transition at all, because no matter how you scale down your empty, the cube is always that large. Okay. This lays to the foundation of our proximity fourth because the distance is overlapping, so it will always output the maximum value no matter what. Okay, well, which means if you try to do a kind of a transition, scaling your empty in this case will never be an option. It will always cause this problem. It will never be as smooth as the other parts, like these cubes, and so on and so forth. Okay. So we have to find a workaround if you really need a kind of a smooth transition. And I will just give you kind of a hint because I do not want to explain the full details of it. So right now I have this kind of everything being set. And instead of using our empties scaling up and down, I'm just going to minus this fourth. And let's just take this minimum and maximum to be 0 and 1, which is the default value. And let's subtract our values. Okay. So right now this is the default cases. And if I subtract, then you can see there's a transition for large cube becomes small cube. And of course I can clamp it so it becomes more kind of natural. So let's start again. I have large cubes and everything scaled down. So I have this transition now. Okay, so this is just the kind of idea. There are definitely more details that you have to implement, but the basic idea here is I have this fourth animation to do the smooth transition from 0 to 1. Okay, so instead of animating my empties, which you will always have this large chunk of cubes being created, I can use this fourth animation for the smooth transition. Okay, so we can definitely change the idea and it's basically working the same. Okay. This is very interesting because I worked with proximity for several years, and this is my first time to actually realize how important this setting is. Okay. So basically this is it. It's pretty short compared to the rest part of the video, but this is really important and very interesting in my opinion. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'll probably see you next time. Bye bye.